Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this November 2nd, 2014 edition of Nightcast. A bushfire burning out of control in Australia's Blue Mountains has destroyed at least one house and threatens more, according to Australian media. An emergency warning has been issued by the Rural Fire Service for residents to monitor the situation after strong winds fueled the blaze. Authorities have said there are up to 50 firefighters in the area being assisted by helicopters dropping water, as you can see here. Australia, Blue Mountains, bushfire burning out of control. That's our opening story for tonight, this Sunday night, November 2nd, friends. And for our next news story, we're going overseas to Laura Westbrook, related to a story on the Ukraine.
Casting their vote in eastern Ukraine. They're choosing who will be in parliament and who's in charge of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
The two frontrunners for president are already the acting leaders in each region. Alexander Zahashenko took over as the head of the rebels in Donetsk in August, and Igor Plotnitsky, a former Soviet army officer, is the rebel leader in Luhansk.
No international monitors are present for the vote, and it's unclear just how many people will go to the polls, although the rebels say they have printed 3 million ballots. What is clear? This is a statement by the Separatists to consolidate their independence from Ukraine. Kiev, the US and the European Union say the elections are illegal and violates the ceasefire deal. Moscow will recognize the polls, a stance that's likely to deepen the diplomatic split with the West. Overnight, 25 fighters on each side were released under the terms of the ceasefire signed nearly 2 months ago. Despite that deal, a battle for Donetsk airport was evident. Several Ukrainian soldiers were reportedly killed in the latest clashes. The UN says more than 300 people have died in the last 10 days alone. For many here, more important than an election is peace, and that doesn't appear to be on the cards anytime soon. Laura Westbrook, BBC News.
All right, thank you very much, Laura Westbrook. And you see the red horse on the screen behind me, friends. That relates to our chart from Revelation, which I'm going to bring forward on the screen. The second column over, you see it's got a red bar. It's got a little red horse at the top of it. Revelation 6 depicts the second seal of the 7 seals of Revelation. This second one is depicted as a red horse. And Jesus Christ described the activity of this second seal, the red horse, and all of the seals of Revelation. He described them in plain language to the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who wrote up what he said in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. And pursuant to this second seal, the red horse, Jesus Christ said in plain language, its activities would be war and rumors of war and world war as well. And we've certainly been having rounds of war in the Ukraine, which this story was just about. And some of these stories that relate to war and civil war, they kind of also relate to the fourth seal on the chart, which is depicted by a pale horse. And even though the first primary thing that Jesus Christ described about this, the activities of this pale horse and its rider named Death, was loimus, meaning disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt. He did also say that this, between the third seal and the fourth seal, that leaves the, let me rephrase that. He said between the third seal and the fifth seal, that leaves only the fourth seal, there would be seismus, meaning seismic activity, commotions in the air such as gale force winds, commotions on the ground such as earthquakes and other seismic activity on the ground and in the air, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, wildfires, flooding, etc. But then he also said, as recorded by Mark in Mark 13 verse 8, that there would be terike, trouble, tribulation, but not the mega tribulation, not the mega trouble of the fifth seal, the great tribulation, but trouble, like prelude music that leads up to the great, grand mega trouble, the great tribulation. And so I say that because our next story, if I were to put a seal on it, I think I'd put the fourth seal on it, the pale horse with the rider named Death, because the terike that Jesus Christ described to happen between the third and the fifth seal is trouble. And troubled waters, the word terike, troubled waters, both literally and figuratively, it means, in the figurative sense, it means mobs and seditions and disturbances. And in this next story, related to the Romanian presidential election, which is set to enter runoff, voters chose a successor to the current president. Romania's presidential election is set to enter a runoff after exit polls suggested no candidate had won an overall majority. Initial polling data indicated that current Prime Minister Victor Ponta has topped the poll with 38 to 40% of the vote. I believe we have a picture of Mr. Ponta right here. We do. His main challenger, Klaus Iohannis, is said to be trailing him by about 32%. Romanians are voting to decide who will replace the current president, who is stepping down after serving his two-term limit. The election in the ex-communist nation has occasionally been marred by bitter recriminations. Mr. Ponta, and a social democrat, often feuded with center-right president, who he served under for 2 years while premier. Frontrunner and current Prime Minister Victor Ponta, again, that's him pictured right here. The Prime Minister tried to have the president impeached in 2012, while for his part, the president recently accused Mr. Ponta of having been a spy. If the politics of this world, friends, it's enough to keep the movie industry and going for a long time. If the vote in Romania enters a runoff, the Prime Minister is likely to face Mr. Iohannis, an ethnic German mayor who has the support of two center-right parties. Turnout in the poll was estimated to be a little over 50%, 52.3%. Romania is the second poorest state in the European Union, which it joined in 2007. It's also one of the EU's most corrupt member states, according to Transparency International. And Romania, dear friends, is one of the areas of the EU that, if you remember Mr. Armstrong's words, he told us to keep an eye on things related to the EU once Romania joined the EU, and then just keep an eye on Romania. Now, Mr. Armstrong died, and he didn't say more, and the details on that are, we keep an eye on it, and we pray and ask God to guide and lead us to understand what we are to be watching for, and just watch and see what's going to happen next. Now, this next story, Also out of Europe, pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, back to Ukraine for a moment, they're holding elections denounced by the West as illegitimate. Presidential and parliamentary polls are being held in two self-proclaimed people's republics in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Now, friends, I've got a video. We had a video report similar to this earlier, and I've got a video just came in among our material here that says this is an update to the earlier report. Sometimes they're exactly the same. Let's roll it and see.
Casting their vote in eastern Ukraine. They're choosing who will be in parliament and who's in charge of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
The two frontrunners for president are already the acting leaders in each region. Alexander Zaharchenko took over as the head of the rebels in Donetsk in August. And Igor Plotnitsky, a former Soviet army officer, is the rebel leader in Luhansk.
Okay, friends, that looks like it's pretty much the same report. There may be a little something different in this report since it's an update, but sometimes there's only such slight difference that, you know, you flip a coin as to which one you use in your report for the evening. I do want to go on, though, to some others. We got a lot of stories tonight. This is a considerable number in that our last evening on was last Thursday. There have been a few things happened over the weekend. And this story comes up from the weekend. Let's see, today's November 2. This is from October 31st news. Let's see, if today's November 2nd, Sunday, Sabbath was November 1st, Saturday, and then end of the month, October, was Friday. Okay, so this is from Friday's news. In the coming months, U.S. oil company Kosmos Energy will begin drilling off the coast of Western Sahara, a disrupted territory claimed by both the government of Morocco and indigenous Sahrawis seeking self-determination. Protest groups there have written an open letter to Kosmos saying the act of drilling would be illegal, a view that Kosmos rejects. And let's see, friends, my opening frame is not matching up to our lead-in about this story. But let me just check ahead in my notes just for a moment. Yeah, okay. Let's, the only thing I can do is if Howard Johnson comes up as the reporter for this Middle East business report next, then we got the right one. Let's see what happens.
From his arrival, the Russian president was in a tough mood, immediately launching into a tirade against the United States. He claimed that since America assumed victory at the end of the Cold War, it had thrown its weight around and tried to shake the world, sowing havoc as a result.
Instead of democracy, there is support of a pretty doubtful group, from open neo-Nazis to Islamic radicals. And why do they support them? Because on a certain level, these radicals and neo-Nazis are being used as a tool for reaching America's goals.
The Ukraine crisis, he alleged, was also part of this American manipulation. But when it came to the mysterious fleeing of Ukraine's former president, Viktor Yanukovych, to Russia, Mr. Putin revealed that far from it being a surprise, he had been closely involved.
Crimea was still part of Ukraine at that time. Under these conditions, it was senseless for him to return to Kiev. He asked for help to move him to Russia, which is what we did.
The main message, though, was one of toughness. Mr. Putin claims he does not want the Soviet Union back, but he clearly does want to return to a Cold War balance where Moscow can defy and challenge the Americans.
Friends, and I'm coming out of that story just for a moment because I've got the Morocco story next, but I went ahead and let that roll, and let me just explain a little bit about this. In the rest of this story, you're going to see how, and what I felt was significant about this story for today, you're going to see how President Putin of Russia helped Yanukovych to flee from the Ukraine. That's coming up in just a moment, right here. Let's roll the rest of this.
President Putin's scathing attack on the United States left some Western participants here taken aback, and it gives some hint perhaps of just how difficult Western leaders are finding it at the moment to talk to the Russian president. Because although he insists Russia does not want confrontation, the message was clear. Unless what Russia wants is respected and fully taken into account, there can be no compromise. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, in Sochi, in southern Russia.
Okay, all right. And apparently, friends, while I was looking through my notes, what I told you was coming up already was in that report. So you've already seen what I said, how he acknowledged that he helped Viktor Yanukovych escape after he was toppled by protests in February. Okay, he was speaking. Actually, this one I pulled from October 25, so that's Monday last week, and that the report followed his speaking on the previous week ago Friday. Mr. Putin said Mr. Yanukovych had asked to be driven away to Russia, and then you saw the report there with Bridget Kendall. All right, now, friends, let's go to the Morocco offshore oil dispute report.
A message from Western Saharan activists to the US oil company Kosmos Energy. In the coming months, Kosmos will work with Scottish firm Cairn Energy to begin exploring for oil 50 kilometres off the coast of Western Sahara. And therein lies the problem. Western Sahara is a disputed territory. When Spanish colonizers left Western Sahara in 1975, the Moroccans moved in from the north, claiming the territory originally belonged to them. War followed between the Moroccan army and the Polisario Front, a guerrilla force made up of the indigenous Sahrawi people. They want an independent country. But attempts by the United Nations to broker a referendum on self-determination have so far failed. Western Sahara remains a non-self-governing territory controlled by Morocco. When energy firms first approached the Moroccan government to search for oil off Western Sahara in 2001, the United Nations was asked to look into the legality of the contracts. The concluding paragraph of the legal opinion, signed by Hans Corell, the then Under-Secretary for Legal Affairs, stated,
"While the specific contracts are not in themselves illegal, if further exploration and exploitation activities were to proceed in disregard of the interests and wishes of the people of Western Sahara, they would be in violation of the principles of international law applicable to mineral resource activities in non-self-governing territories."
This month, Sahrawi human rights organisations sent an open letter to Kosmos Energy. They accused Kosmos of ignoring them, choosing instead to speak to groups and individuals appointed by the Moroccan government. So I had planned to travel to Western Sahara to meet representatives of the Sahrawi people, but was denied access by the Moroccan authorities. So instead, and at great personal risk, an activist has travelled here to the Moroccan capital, Rabat, to meet me in person. In Western Sahara, it's common for journalists and activists to be followed by plainclothes secret police. Activists say they've been interrogated, beaten, or even imprisoned for voicing their opinion. Despite this threat, Lakal Salem, one of the signatories of the open letter, said he wanted to be interviewed without disguising his identity. He says Kosmos Energy aren't speaking to the right people.
Morocco don't allow the registration of any NGO that can claim self-determination of the Sahara people. So we are not registered, we are not allowed to assembly or to have a local. So I think that Kosmos is helping Morocco, is giving new arguments to Morocco when not meeting with Sahrawi NGOs that can have the other voice. While passing the agreement with Morocco, Cosmos didn't deal with the Polisario, and that's a big problem, because the majority of the Sahrawis on the occupied territories known the Polisario as the only representative of the Sahrawi.
Two broke up in midair during a test flight on Friday, killing one of the pilots and seriously injuring the other. David Willis reports from on the ground at the scene of the crash.
Littering this inhospitable desert terrain are pieces of the downed spacecraft, huge pieces in certain cases like this one, which is part of the tail. You can see that this came down just a few feet from a nearby road. Now the plan is to gather all of these pieces together, move them to a local laboratory, and there inspectors will be able to go through them and try to work out what went wrong. One thing they have in their favor is that SpaceShipTwo was fitted with numerous cameras, because this was, after all, a test flight. So the feeling is that that footage could be very revealing. Also of potentially enormous benefit to the investigators, the evidence that the surviving pilot will be able to give of the final moments of SpaceShipTwo. Now, there has been speculation that some change in rocket fuel may have played a part, at least, in this disaster, but officials were saying here a short while ago that it could be as long as a year before they really get to the bottom of what happened here. And if it does take that long, for all the enthusiasm, for all the optimism displayed by Sir Richard Branson yesterday, that would pose a major blow to the future of the space tourism industry.
Friends, tensions are mounting in Burkina Faso after Army Chief General Honor Tarour seized power following the ousting of Blaise Compaoré from his 27-year presidency. Army Chief Traoré said he had taken over, but it was not clear if he had the backing of all the military. The BBC's Leila Adjovi reports from where a protest rally has been taking place.
After the confusion of this past few days, the situation is becoming more tense in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou. After thousands gathered on Nation Square this morning on the call of the opposition and civil society movements to denounce seizure of power by the army, crowds gathered in front of the national television because two civilians were about to make announcements that they could take power and head this transition. But according to several sources, the army wouldn't have it. Shots were fired in the air to disperse the crowd, and some people here around us claim that they've been mistreated and that there was violence from the army against the crowd. So it's still unclear who's going to be able to head this transition and bring peace back to the country.
Okay, thank you. And friends, in what I could use in our last report tonight, and one way I'd like to make this the last report, before I roll into this, I'd like to ask a favor of all of us. I'd like to ask you, as you watch this next report, to try to divorce yourself from the different culture of the people and pretend that this was your mother grieving over the loss of some of her family. Or if you can step into the thing you're fully yourself, put your shoes into the person you'll see grieving the loss of some of their family who's been killed, and I'll tell you how in a moment. Put yourself fully in their shoes, as if this were you losing some of your loved ones. Say your country was in the situation that exists there, and which could happen. And frankly, there are things that will happen even in the United States and in the UK. And do I have that story on Germany? We can't close after this story. I got a story I've got to tell you about related to Germany and the UK. But let's go to this one now. More than and listen, what I'm hoping this story will do for all of us, since Jesus Christ instructed us in Luke 21 verse 36 to watch the things that would lead up to the fifth seal, to the Great Tribulation. Watch the religious deception. Watch the wars and rumors of war, and the famine and the disease epidemics and the seismic activity and the trouble. Just the general trouble that's the prelude to the great mega trouble, to the Great Tribulation. Watch all this going on in the news, he said, and pray about it. Pray always. And pray for these people. Pray. As Christ told us in the model prayer. Well, what do we pray? Christ gave us a model prayer saying, honor our Father, thy kingdom come, thy kingdom come. Thy will on this earth be done. It's certainly not God's will to see all this stuff like in this next news story that's going on. More than 50 people. And so I hope you'll put your heart in your prayers tonight and pray, thy kingdom come. More than 50 people, including some related to this dear lady, have been killed and at least 100 injured in a suicide bombing close to Pakistan's only border crossing with India. The blast was near the checkpoint at the border crossing near Lahore. At least 3 jihadi militant groups, including the Pakistani Taliban, have claimed responsibility for the attacks, as Shazeb Jalani reports.
Distraught survivors of Sunday's suicide blast. Rescue workers rushed the dead and the wounded to nearby hospitals. In Lahore, weeping relatives mourned their loss. Among those killed were women and children. One family lost 8 of its members.
We moved 50 dead bodies from a hospital emergency ward. More bodies are still coming. More than 100 people are wounded.
The attack took place at the end of a daily parade at Pakistan's only border crossing with India. The Wagah crossing draws a big crowd. Local and foreign tourists come here to enjoy this spectacle, considered to be a must-see ritual between the hostile neighbors. Hundreds of people were leaving this place at the end of the ceremony on Sunday when the bombers struck. The crossing has now been closed for 3 days. At least 3 jihadi militant groups in Pakistan have said they ordered the attack. A group called Jundullah said the bombing was a retaliation against Pakistan's military offensive in the tribal areas along the Afghan border. Shazeb Jalani, BBC News, Karachi.
Okay, and dear friends, I've got a couple of, I don't know why my button's not working. There it is, we're coming out. I'm going to skip through a couple stories. I had a story about how they're making, Holland is making food out of insects. But I'm going to skip the video report on that, and I am going to real quickly turn into the Bible to Leviticus 11 and verse 19, beginning verse 19 and a couple other verses. Leviticus 11 is one of the clean and unclean meats chapters of the Bible. I believe Deuteronomy 14 may be the other place that mentions the unclean and clean meats. And yes, it is Deuteronomy 14 and Leviticus 11. There have been stories about how the Ebola is related to bats, and people in Africa eat bats, but it tells us here in verse 19 of Leviticus 11, some of the animals that are expressly shall not be eaten are the stork, the heron after her kind, the lapwing, and the bat, among many other animals mentioned here. And I wanted to specifically mention that one, but there are some insects that are permissible to eat. For example, if you look at verse 22, now not all insects, but verse 22 says, even these of them you may eat. verse 21, he begins talking about, these may you eat of every flying, creeping thing that goes upon all four, which have legs above the feet, to leap withal upon the earth. Even these of them which you may eat, the locust after his kind, the bald locust after his kind, the beetle after his kind, and the grasshopper after his kind. But verse 23, all other flying, creeping things which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you. So, but the point is, there are some insects that are clean to eat. Grasshopper is one of them. Beetle is another one. But I'm skipping that story about how they're going to be making this food out of insects, some of which are not edible insects, and doing so because of an anticipated population explosion. And skipping the story about how they're raising alligators to sell for the skins. But this one I definitely want to cover. Angela Merkel is reported to have told David Cameron that she will not negotiate on EU migration. That's the caption below this photograph in News, a news report from today. This is from today's news, BBC News. Chancellor Angela Merkel would rather see the UK exit from the European Union than compromise over the principle of free movement of workers, according to the German magazine Der Spiegel. Okay, BBC News gave this to us. They pulled it out of Der Spiegel. Mrs. Merkel is alleged to fear that the UK is approaching a point of no return. Downing Street would not comment on the reports. Mr. Cameron wants to renegotiate the terms of the UK's continued membership before holding an in-out referendum. The Prime Minister said that freedom of movement would be, quote, at the very heart of my renegotiation strategy for Europe, end quote. But Mrs. Merkel is said by the magazine Der Spiegel to have made clear she will withdraw her support for the UK's continued EU membership if he continues to push for migration reform. This is the first time that Mrs. Merkel has acknowledged that the UK's exit from the EU is possible, Der Spiegel said. According to the Sunday Times, Germany has already rejected a proposal to impose quotas on low-skilled EU migrants by limiting the national insurance numbers issued to them. Der Spiegel reported that Mr. Cameron was now looking at a plan to stretch the EU rules, quote, to their limits in order to ban migrants who do not have a job and to deport those who are unable to support themselves after 3 months. Today, Sunday, Conservative Member of Parliament and former Justice Secretary Kenneth Clarke defended EU migration. Quote, if you're going to have a sensible single market, if we want to compete with the Americans and the Chinese and so on, and the modern world, we need the free movement of labor, he told BBC's Sunday Politics. A Downing Street spokesman said Mr. Cameron would make a speech on immigration before December 25 and stressed, you can be sure he will always put Britain first. Friends, that's it for our Sunday night report, November 2nd, God willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll be back again tomorrow night, Monday night, with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until next time, this is your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.